Hey, welcome. I want to thank Admiral Winter, his staff, his team that have put this together, celebrating 70 years, and an important milestone. As I look across the audience, I think we have today a mix of ONR, NRL, warfighters. I know there are folks from OSD here, so it's a broad community that we're talking to today. And I want to try to blend a few things together. In my talks, more importantly, I want to make sure everybody's going to get out to the courtyard and take the opportunity to walk around and not just see the exhibits. What's really important to do is talk to the folks, okay, that are bringing their exhibits here and get an understanding of how special they are in terms of their skills, their knowledge, their expertise. Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to host an annual Scientists and Engineers Award ceremony. And one by one, as we brought individuals up from across the Naval Research and Development establishment and highlighted their contributions to our warfighting efforts, it's not just impressive, it's amazing the talent that we've got out there working on some of the most perplexing problems before the Navy and Marine Corps. Dedicated, talented individuals that are trying to make the breakthroughs necessary that our sailors and Marines are relying upon around the world. So get out in the courtyard, make sure you take the time to talk to the individuals that are out there, a special breed that are dedicating their talents for our country. A couple points, and they're important points, and I start many of my talks emphasizing this. Point number one. Our Navy and Marine Corps is the most capable expeditionary force, most capable fighting force in the world. Whether we're talking about the launch of a Super Hornet from the deck of a nuclear-powered Nimitz aircraft carrier, or the launch of a Sidewinder air-to-air missile from the wing of that Super Hornet, or the launch of a Trident II ballistic missile from the tube of a submerged Ohio-class submarine, or the launch of a Tomahawk missile from the tube of a submerged Virginia-class submarine, or an SM-6 surface-to-air missile from the vertical launch system of a DDG-51 destroyer, or a landing craft from the well deck of an amphibious assault ship, or a Marine from the ramp of an MV-22 tilt-rotor Osprey on the battlefield, distant from shore. From the Baltic Sea to the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Straits of Hormuz to the Straits of Malacca, from the South China Sea to the Sea of Japan, from the ocean bottom to the ocean surface, to the depths of space, from below the Arctic cap to the Hindu Kush. Our Navy and Marine Corps is the most capable fighting force in the world. And the fact is that no other military, no other nation on earth has the capability or the capacity or the resolve to perform the missions that our sailors and Marines perform around the world today. Now, our superiority at sea or on the battlefield is entirely underpinned and dependent upon our superiority in technology. And that is an advantage that we have held throughout our lifetimes. It's an advantage that underpins our national security, and it will be more important in the future than it is today. Now, Winston Churchill, he once remarked that the farther back you look, the farther ahead you can see. So I'm going to look back a little bit here. I'm going to go back a century to 1916. In 1916, the world was at war. The world was at war, but we here in the United States, we were in isolation. We believed that we could maintain our isolation from the war going on in Europe, but in due time, largely related to incidents at sea, we were drawn into that war. And so we went all in. We went all in, but we went in all in late. And when we got to Europe, we discovered that our military was far behind in terms of technology. We weren't ready for the war that we entered. The battlefields of Europe caught us off guard, caught us by surprise. And it was a bloody war. So when the war came to an end, and we decided we were going to declare the peace dividend with the rest of the world, as we went forward and signed a thing called the Washington Naval Treaty, and went about the business of dismantling the military that we had crossed the Atlantic with, there were a group of individuals that determined that we can no longer imagine that future wars will be protected by the two great oceans that bound our country. That we can't remain in isolation. That, in fact, we have to maintain a degree of preparedness for future wars unlike the past. And that degree of preparedness really had to start in the sciences and technologies. And so they went forward to the president and proposed, and was ultimately approved, to establish what we now know as the Naval Research Laboratory. Prominent individuals, led by Thomas Edison himself, suggested, recommended, argued that we have to have a special establishment that is not simply working on science and technology, but specifically those fundamental technologies that would underpin naval warfare in the future. So in 1923, Naval Research Laboratory was established, and immediately began working on the technologies at the time that, in fact, were missing in World War I and that would be significant in the future. Specifically, radio communications, one of the early technologies that NRL launched into, high-frequency radio communications. And in working on high-frequency communications at the NRL, they set themselves up a range for communications across the Potomac. And with antennas and receivers established, comms went back and forth. Now, at the time, there was an individual working at NRL, a Navy commander by the name of Deke Parsons. And one of the things that he observed was that as traffic moved up and down the Potomac, the radio communications would be interfered with. And so after a while, he started to realize that this wasn't so much of an encumbrance. This was actually a potential that we could work on. And so he went to the Navy headquarters and reported that I believe that these systems that are designed for radio communications have a benefit that could help in locating ships at sea. And so the individuals at the naval headquarters, they took a look at their budget, and they concluded that this is not in our budget. And so they defer that to a future budget cycle. But NRL kept working away on it. They kept working away on it. In fact, were one of the early leaders in radar development, which became prominent throughout World War II. Fundamental to the core of the NRL. Now, Deke Parsons would go on and become prominent throughout the Second World War as a leader in terms of naval warfare and developments. He became central ultimately to the Manhattan Project, but also early on in the war, as we were trying to determine how to improve naval gunnery, he took the notion of this technology that was being developed at NRL, associated with the radar, went back to work with the Navy lab to try to figure out how do we take that same technology and package it into the nose cone of a round. And in fact, NRL, through some prototyping, packaged small radar technology in the nose cone of 5-inch ordnance, put together a couple pallets, and Deke Parsons went to sea in the Pacific looking for targets to demonstrate the effectiveness of what became the proximity fuse. And as a result, first the commanding officer of the ship that he went on board with thought he was a little bit crazy. You want to go find aerial targets and hope that your system is more effective. In fact, what he demonstrated was that the proximity fuse provided a 10-fold increase in terms of the weapon's effectiveness for naval gunnery. It became a major breakthrough in the war. So here you have an individual that started at the Naval Research Laboratory, working on radio communications, tripped across radar technology, which spawned an entire industry of itself, went on further to identify the opportunity to package that technology in the nose cone of a gunnery round to increase their effectiveness of naval gunnery against aerial targets during the war. This all occurring in a period of about 5 years' time. Deke Parsons himself went on to join the Manhattan Project, which has much history traced again to the Naval Research Laboratory through uranium enrichment techniques that NRL contributed to. And Deke became the individual who weaponized the atomic bomb, and in fact was the individual that rode with the Enola Gay to arm the first atomic bomb many years ago. The point is the Naval Research Laboratory, which started in 1923 with the notion that we need to continue development of technologies that are unique to naval warfare because the commercial industry will not do that. Private industry will not do that. So we have to have a focus on those technologies that we will need in time of war. We need expertise that's going to push those technologies along. It requires deep expertise, not just in the specific sciences, but also expertise in the warfare application of those sciences. So it requires a very unique facility and experts that have one hand on the fleet, one hand on the technology. It also requires continuity. Breakthroughs in technology might be episodic, but they only result from long endured efforts to reach that point in breakthrough. And quite often, they're not planned, they're not estimated, they're not forecast, but they are opportunities that the right individual at the right time and place can exploit. So from that early radar development, NRL continued its efforts in the area. Monopulse techniques were in fact developed during the war, which today are still core to radar technology. The early radars that were put on board ship came from the first development efforts at NRL. I already talked about naval gunnery. I touched on the efforts in terms of the Manhattan Project and uranium enrichment. Entirely separate was an individual at NRL in 1939 who, when he was introduced to this technology and started to explore it, drafted a memo that suggested that from this technology, we could in fact develop propulsion systems for submarines, 1939. During the war, beyond our efforts, there was also development overseas. Germany worked on the ballistic missiles, V-1 and V-2. What we know today as the cruise missile, in fact, was the kamikaze during World War II, and of course the nuclear weapon itself. Huge expanse in terms of technology being applied to the science of warfare. At war's end, the United States had 12 million men and women in uniform. We had well over 1,000 ships, and we had tens of thousands of aircraft. 45% of our gross domestic product went towards making war power. And we were, at war's end, we were not standing alone. We had the Soviet Union that we were confronting, and we had to arrive at a strategy, a national security strategy, that would allow us to maintain our prominence, our national security, but not require us to sustain the type of investments that we had during the war. It was recognized that we will never again be an isolationist country. We were the world leader. We were the free world leader. But we could not afford the great investment that we had made during the war. So the national security strategy ended up arriving at a couple of key points. One, we would leverage our advantage in nuclear weapons. We were the only nuclear power at the time, and we would rely heavily on those nuclear weapons to provide us an edge that would deter future war. But second, we would ensure that we sustained our technological superiority around the globe, that our military throughout the war, its great advantage on the battlefield was technological superiority, and we would not let go of that. So in the course of the war, the assemblage of the laboratory system that was required to advance our warfighting systems, we're going to hold on to that. So in 1946, the President signed out an order that basically established the laboratory system that we have today, and at that same time, we formulated the Office of Naval Research to continue on with the developments, naval unique, that will ensure our continued technological superiority in the years ahead. So in the 40s, Naval Research Laboratory continued its not just radar developments, but its development in those areas that were naval unique, and the Office of Naval Research got off the ground. If you look at the ONR today, and you look at its structure, very similar to the structure back in 1946. Focus on maritime environment, ocean sciences and the weather, navigation, communications and radar technology, naval weapons, hull mechanical and electrical systems, propulsion, power generation, damage control, corrosion control, manufacturing technology, early computing, including efforts that led to the first digital computer. 1950s, Arleigh Burke, Chief of Naval Operation, he had been assigned early in his career to the Naval Ordnance Lab and had a great appreciation for the laboratory system and the technologies that they were working on that are naval unique and that we need to continue to invest in. Strong proponent for a strong research and development base. And as CNO, he recognized the great benefit that would be provided by nuclear propulsion and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. So, during a period when we were increasing our investment in nuclear weapons, starting our investment in nuclear power, he turned to the Office of Naval Research. We had to overcome some significant challenges associated with developing a ballistic missile that could travel at that time 1,500 nautical miles, the propellant that would be required for that missile to be able to safely store it on a submerged submarine, and also to get the power density that we would require for those ranges coming out of missile tube of the submarines at the time. This development going on in parallel with development of nuclear propulsion for the future submarine fleet. So he turned to the Office of Naval Research and ONR, working with Admiral Rayburn at the time, who's fondly referred to as the father of the ballistic missile submarine and the strategic weapons systems, went to work developing what would ultimately become the Polaris missile. Meanwhile, continued radar development, vacuum tubes, traveling wave tubes, klystrons, focal plane arrays, all during the 1950s. And later in that decade and through the 60s, the space race would begin, national priority. So the Naval Research and Development Establishment took a lead. Our interest in this ocean sciences, in navigation, meteorology, led to a natural inclination towards space. So we had a leading role in the Vanguard program, our first satellites, first Intel satellite, and then ultimately time-based navigation. Time-based navigation which would give us global positioning system, precision-guided munitions, firmly establishing the Navy in what became known as the second offset. First offset, nuclear weapons. Second offset, precision-guided munitions. Naval Research Lab, ONR, leading roles. In the decades since, ONR pressed forward with development in semiconductor materials and their manufacturing. First, gallium arsenide, the building block for today's radar systems, and then gallium nitride, the building block for future radar systems. Laser technology, fiber optics, unmanned vehicles and autonomy, exploitation of the radio frequency spectrum which would lead to introduction of electronic warfare, decoy systems, deep submersibles, development of advanced naval hull, mechanical and electrical systems, things as ubiquitous as aqueous film-forming foam for firefighting, purple K powder, which many of you probably remember, water mist today, corrosion control, battery technology and energy storage, high-temperature superconducting, which today is going on board ships in the form of advanced degaussing, permanent magnet motors, which today is under development for the Ohio replacement. Advanced manufacturing and materials. Bottom line is when you walk aboard a ship or climb into the cockpit of an aircraft, you cannot look around without seeing systems that in their genealogy, their early development, did not come out of the Office of Naval Research and its efforts in the Naval Research Lab. It's ubiquitous. So as we look to the future, it's no surprise that ONR and NRO will play a leading role in today's efforts to develop the technologies that will underpin what is being called the third offset strategy: unmanned systems, autonomy, advanced man-machine interoperability. I thought I'd give just one example, something that, where's Nevin? Something that Nevin and I worked together on years ago. One example, 20 years ago, I was the production officer on DDG-51s, and Nevin at the time was a resource sponsor for the Arleigh Burke program, would later become commanding officer of one of the early ships of the class. If you were to walk aboard the 51 back then, the first thing, obviously, that you'd be introduced to is the Aegis weapon system, the spy radar. You can't look at the spy radar and not go back to those early years at NRL and the development of the XAF radar at the beginning of World War II, and look at the monopulse techniques that were developed. Look at the gallium arsenide semiconductor materials that are embedded throughout the radar, all coming out of ONR and the Naval Research Lab. The Klystron, traveling wave tubes, spy radar, its heritage, its genealogy, tracing back to ONR. Then the Standard Missile. The Standard Missile, the principal weapon on board our AAW destroyers and cruisers. And you think back to the proximity fuse that Deke Parsons, having leveraged his early work at the NRL, in the solid rocket propellants that were formulated during the early years of searching for the right chemistry for our ballistic missiles that would ultimately become common across our family of missiles. And then to the Aegis Command and Decision System. And you trace again back to the early days of advanced computing, high-speed computing, digital computing, all coming out of the efforts that were spawned from the Office of Naval Research. The electronic warfare system on board at the time, the AN/SLIC 32, it was, in fact, direct descendant of the early efforts by ONR in terms of advancing EW and the early efforts in terms of specific emitter identification. Tomahawk missile that's so core, the first weapon fired in time of war, so core to the Arleigh Burke's arsenal. And then you look at, okay, the effectiveness of the Tomahawk missile, it drives right back to precision-guided munitions and the efforts that put GPS constellation in space. Walk the decks, the HM&E, the hull mechanical and electrical systems. Again, the aqueous film for AFFF, aqueous film forming foam, the PKP, watertight doors, something as basic as watertight doors, the technologies that again spawned out of ONR, solid state lighting, coating systems, everything from the fuel and seawater tanks right up to the decks, topside, anti-fouling systems in the exterior hull, the non-skid on the flight deck. You could not walk that ship, you could not trace one system's genealogy without coming back to scientists and engineers at ONR and NRL. That was 20 years ago. Today you go on board. Today you go on board in the Mediterranean, a destroyer that's forward deployed in the Mediterranean, and the first thing you might notice is the installation of what we refer to as CWIP Block 2, the Surface Electronic Warfare Improvement Program. A huge advance in electronic warfare. Block 2 to be followed by Block 3, all coming directly out of the technologies that have been fostered, developed by ONR and NRL. The next leap that we need in electronic warfare, the next building block leading to the future. And if you were to take a look on board the USS Ross and Carney, as they had to deal with a threat that emerged in the Eastern Mediterranean, Russian weapons sold to Syria that we were not prepared for. We're not prepared for. Forward deployed ships needed something now. So the fleet turned to ONR and NRL and said, what do you got? And NRL went to work that they had been slugging away at for years and put together a modular system, which I believe Admiral Breckinridge made reference to, TOOM, the Transportable Electronic Warfare Module, and said, well, you know what? This hasn't gone through all the DOT&E certifications, but we have a system where the technology is mature because we have been working away on it, and we think it'll do the job. So we shipped the TOOM out to the Eastern Mediterranean and gave those forward deployed destroyers the capability that they need to continue to operate with impunity on those seas. That's today. Tomorrow, as we continue the development and start the manufacturing for our Flight 3 destroyers, you'll see the air and missile defense radar, the next great leap ahead in terms of surface ship AAW radar capability. AMDR leverages the fundamental building block of the AMDR is that GAN technology that came right out of ONR. It gives a 64-fold increase to that radar compared to the SPY-1 radar that's on Aegis destroyers today. So now how do you get there? Well, you get there by slugging away. GAN didn't happen overnight. GAN was in development for about 20 years before the technology was mature enough to leave the laboratory and go into manufacturing. But it's a huge leap, and so it was worth the investment of time and talent into that technology to bring forward the system that's going ahead today. And GAN now is not just the technology that will be going into the AMDR radar. It's also going to go into ground-air task-oriented radar for the Marine Corps. It's going into the next generation jammer for naval aviation, and it will become the building block for future RF systems. Spook 9B. Spook 9B will also be installed on board our Flight 3 destroyers. It's an X-band radar that was developed directly from the technologies that were harvested from the Naval Research Lab and ONR. So the Spook 9B in combination with the AMDR will provide the horizon coverage and the ballistic missile defense coverage that our fleet needs. And the last thing to mention is the hybrid electric drive. So beyond just our gas turbine gear-driven technology that we've relied on for the last 30 years, we're moving forward with hybrid electric drive, the basic components of which were technologies that were pushed over a number of decades by NRL and the ONR. That's today and tomorrow. The future is much about directed energy. When we look at the battle problem of the future, we recognize that our magazines are limited. We need deeper magazines. And we recognize that the cost of our weapon systems today are dear. And so we need deep magazines that when you effectively reload those magazines, it's not putting such a drain on the Treasury. So we look at directed energy as providing the promise, whether it's laser weapons or whether it's the railgun that ONR has been developing for about 15 years now. We're looking for weapon systems that provide that continued advantage that we enjoy today in terms of superiority at sea, but we also recognize that the threat is also advancing, and we've got to, more than just keep pace, we've got to accelerate the pace going forward. Which brings me to hypervelocity projectiles, which were not the focal point for a lot of the development going on in the railgun system. But as we pushed railgun along, and as we looked at the capability that it provides, and we looked at what the threat was doing, we've shifted more investment to hypervelocity projectiles for the promise that it provides. So the farther you look back, the further forward you can see. The Navy and Marine Corps, we're technology driven. I could continue to walk through examples, but the reality is that, again, you cannot walk on board a ship or climb into a cockpit without seeing a system or a capability that ONR over the last 70 years in the Naval Research Lab over much of the past century have not put blood and sweat and fingerprints upon to get those into the hands of our sailors and Marines. There's much talk of innovation these days, as though it's something that we are looking for. But the reality is that the history of the Office of Naval Research is the history of innovation. The folks here today, the folks at the lab today, the folks in the courtyard today are a cadre of individuals that are extraordinarily talented, that have chosen to spend their talents in the defense of our nation. The innovation, the leaps forward, the breakthroughs that occur, they are episodic. But the innovation is that talent coming to work every day, working on meaningful projects where they know that the results of their efforts will be placed in the hands of sailors and Marines to make them more effective on the battlefield, make them safer, make them more lethal, and do so in a fashion that, if we are successful, they will never have to use those weapons. The key to ONR's success in the past is the key to our success in the future. It's sustained, continuous development, because breakthroughs, again, may be episodic, but the effort must be continuous. It's working on naval unique matters. There is a large industry out there, commercial industry, private industry, but they're not motivated to address the issues that are unique to naval warfare. We've got to ensure that we are focused on those things that are unique to naval warfare. And it's doing work, it's ensuring that the work is being done by, frankly, world experts. World experts. In the history of ONR, you can trace 50 Nobel Prizes to the efforts of folks that have worked at ONR over the last 70 years. They're world experts. That's what it takes. That's what it takes if you are to remain the most capable fighting force in the world. And leadership must have a tolerance for failure. If you're going to push the boundaries of science and technology, you have to recognize that you will fail often in order to succeed once. So leadership has to have a tolerance for failure. But the tolerance for failure must be balanced with a record of success. We have to have successes along the way that make the difference in order to win the investment that the nation makes in these crown jewels that we have in our laboratory system. And in fact, we have been fortunate to have a long history of success coming out of NRL and the ONR.